All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today. I'm really bummed that we can't meet in person, but I'm really happy that we can still do this virtually. I'm over in the US in Minnesota, so it's 8 a.m. here. I've got my morning coffee to power me through the morning. Hopefully y'all have a nice tasty afternoon beverage in front of you as well. Like I mentioned in both Slack and the WebEx chat, I'll be looking through questions in Slack before or after towards the end of the talk. I'll try and address anything as we're going through, but we should have some time at the end to chat as well. I'll also share the slide deck and any resources in Slack after the fact as well. So first things first, my name is Jenna Pederson, and I'm a new developer advocate at AWS. For the previous 9 years, I worked with Fortune 500 companies to improve their software delivery, and I also worked with early stage startups and budding entrepreneurs to help them launch products. I've worked with teams ranging from solo all the way to my own solo all on my own to 100 plus developers. I've worked in large, monolithic, highly coupled code bases, untested code bases, and I've also had the privilege of being able to work on many greenfield projects, starting from scratch. So much of my career has been spent helping development teams get better at writing code and delivering software. So the backstory here, 5 years ago, I realized that the place that I called home wasn't really feeling like home anymore. I wasn't able to focus. I didn't care about it anymore. I didn't want to be there anymore. I wasn't comfortable. I wasn't motivated to do a whole lot. So around that same time, I read the book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up by Marie Kondo. It was this book and a few others that helped me realize that why tidying and to some extent minimalism were important in my home, in my life, and it also reinforced it in my work life. I spent a year applying some of those same principles in my home and in my life, and today I want to talk to you about how we can apply some of these in our code base so that we can make better decisions, be more confident, and to be more productive. We'll talk about what joy looks like, why we want to keep a tidy code base, and then we'll also talk about how we get there and how we find that magic. So the KonMari method is named after Marie Kondo herself, the author. In her book, she shares her method of tidying as not a set of rules, but about shifting your mindset. So the KonMari method encourages tidying by category, not by location. Beginning with clothes, then moving on to papers, kimono or miscellaneous items, and finally, sentimental items. We keep only those things that speak to the heart, and we discard items that no longer spark joy. We thank them for their service, and then we let them go. In Marie's book, one of the first steps is keeping only that which sparks joy. She urges the reader to take things they own into their own hands and ask themselves, does this spark joy? Unless it's an emphatic yes, it gets discarded. Just like joy will look different for each person in their home, it will look different for each team as well, and each person on each team. So for small teams, or teams of one, joy might look like this. It might look like being productive and confident across the stack. For larger teams, joy might look like being productive and confident across our team, between teams, and being able to quickly make decisions about and act on the risk of a particular change. It's quite likely your team has already defined some of this, whether it's written down or it's in someone's head. You might have style guides, linters, or automated test expectations for the team. And if you do have that stuff already, you can work backward and figure out the purpose of that, how it sparks joy among your team. And if it doesn't, that might be something that you discard. So, like I said, joy is going to look different for everybody. And we need to define what that joy looks like for our team. For me, this is what it looks like. I need to be productive. I want to be able to build and run my app in one step. I want code generators that don't generate dead code or layers upon layers just for the sake of a framework. I want automated linters. I want tests to run automatically. And I want my changes to be immediately reflected in my app during development. I don't want to have to manually restart my server if there's any reason to not have to do that. I also want feedback. I want to know that I broke a test when I broke it, not a couple days from now when someone else merges in their code to my branch. I want consistency. And if something is not consistent, I want to be able to know that we explicitly decided to be inconsistent. I want to know that we did something different for a specific reason. I also want to be confident. I want to be confident when I make a change that I won't break other functionality. And I want to be confident that the decisions I'm making are in the best interest of the code base, my team, and my product. I want to be able to experiment safely and try new things quickly. I want to collaborate effectively, both in my team and across teams. I want to be able to build in quality early. I want to be able to make decisions quickly and trade-offs effectively. I also want to be able to observe and monitor what is happening with my software in real time so that I can respond and resolve to issues in real time. When a customer reports an issue, I want to be able to investigate. And when issues do occur, I don't want customers to report it. I want to be proactive. I want to know that it happened. My system should be able to tell me that it happened. So why do we want tidy? And more importantly, how are we going to sell this up to our management? So if we look at this, this list here, we are going to write code for humans. We are going to be more confident with a tidy code base and more productive. We also build quality in early. And a tidy code base is going to help both with developer onboarding and developer happiness. And all of these things lead to the cost savings, and that's what management is going to be interested in. So if we look at each of these individually, we are writing code for humans. A tidy code base, it makes it easier for people to read, understand, and to reason about. We actually spend more time reading our code than we do writing it. We're reading it, debugging it, documenting it, thinking about it, debugging it, testing it. And did I mention we're debugging it? As our code base grows, so do the complexities, the dependencies, and the intricacies. And it becomes hard for one person to understand it all, especially if they weren't the original author, but also even if they were the original author. As Donald Knuth, one of the greatest computer scientists and mathematicians ever, once said, programming is the art of telling another human what one wants the computer to do. We're really keeping a tidy code base for ourselves and for our teammates. With a tidy code base, we're going to be more confident. Marie Kondo says, one of the magical effects of tidying is confidence in our decision-making capacity. Faster decision-making means we can act quicker, deliver earlier, and change direction more easily. Mechanisms like consistency, standards, and conventions define rules for us so that we can make decisions quicker, or we can push the decision-making off to those conventions and standards. We can even automate that. So when I review messy code, I'm not confident that it will work, but I'm more confident when it's well formatted, adheres to established and consistent coding style guidelines, and follows software design principles. We're also more productive with a tidier code base. We can find the files that we need to change. Everything is in its expected place. And we can understand the code that we're reading and more quickly make decisions about it. We're also going to get more feedback more often, whether that's with writing new tests, changing existing code, with compilation, workflow automation, or linters. We can actually automate some of these decisions for us so that we don't even have to make them. So that's one step that we're able to eliminate from our process by automating it. For instance, linters and formatters, they can be set up into different integration points in your workflow so that reformatting happens when we save the file. With a tidy code base, we can also build in quality early. Because we can better understand the code we're reading, we're more likely to build higher quality software. Bugs are not going to be obscured by complex code, and it becomes easier to refactor and to test. But with a tidy code base, developer onboarding also gets easier. If we consider the new people joining our team and reading the code base for the first time, we can ask a handful of questions just to figure out if this is easy or hard for them. And if you've brought anyone onto your team before, you might already know the answer to this. Some of these questions are the files and classes and functions in their proper place? Or are they at least in a consistent place across the code base? Is the code explicit in what it's doing? Are variables and functions named appropriately? Do they actually communicate what's happening? Are you using standards and conventions? Do you have a documented code style guide? Is there any documentation? Is there a getting started guide? What if your new teammates could onboard in one day instead of 6? Or one day instead of 1 month or 6 months? I've actually been on teams where it took several weeks to get the full app up and running on my local development environment. This was almost 15 years ago, and this happened to be one of the very large, complex, coupled code bases that had very few tests. But I do still see this today, even in smaller code bases, where new developers join a team and then they have to have their hand held through the entire process because nothing is done consistently with the standards that are for that tech stack or even just standard software development principles. But what if they could start contributing on day one? If we had that style guide, if we had a getting started guide, if files and classes were named appropriately and in consistent places, this would be a lot easier for us and for the developers that we're onboarding. And then there's developer happiness. Do your code base, your processes, or your tools actually make you want to throw things? Do you get frustrated when you have to restart the app server just because you made one tiny change? I've been on teams where this is the case, and too many people have said, that's just how we've always done it. Don't be that person. I assure you, you can be the one to make that change and to make the improvements, even if they're small and gradual. Your team will follow your lead. In fact, they're probably wanting these changes as well. So as soon as one person gets started, the stuff starts to build up and other people want it, and other people are more likely to help out in that process. And lastly, there's cost savings involved in having a tidy code base. All of these reasons for tidying lead to the one that the business will be the most interested in, which is this cost savings. There's less to maintain. It's easier to maintain. It's easier to extend and easier to test. It's also easier to debug because we've made it more readable. We understand where things are. There's also higher productivity And higher confidence is going to lead to quicker and more effective decisions, quicker onboarding, and less developer turnover. And in case you're not familiar, developer turnover is a huge expense. To replace a developer or an engineer, it typically costs 6 to 9 months of that developer's salary. And that's just to get them in the door. That doesn't count for onboarding time or any lost productivity of the other team members that have to help with onboarding. So how do we actually go about finding this magic and tidying up our code base? Throughout Marie Kondo's book, she talks about the guidelines she sets for her clients. And I've adapted them here to work for our purposes of tidying a code base. First and foremost, we need to commit to tidying up. Then we visualize our destination, discard what doesn't spark joy. Then we're going to tidy by category, not by location. And we'll get into these a little bit more. And then we're going to tidy a little every day. So for the first guideline, commit yourself to tidying up. We want to actually commit yourself and your team to tidying up. We need to make sure that management is on board with this because we want to get dedicated time on the calendar for it. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit throughout as well, but this could be a full month of a developer's time. It could be the full team's time for an entire sprint, or it could be 25% of every sprint until the end of the year, at least for this initial stab at getting at tidying up your code base. But what we want to do is build this time in. And if you can't, I urge you to do it anyway. Find a way to incorporate these changes in smaller time commitments. So again, if you can't dedicate a full person for a sprint, dedicate 25% of that person's time for 4 sprints, but find a way. But you might be asking how much time we should be dedicating to this. And that's going to depend on where you need to go and the current state of your code base and your team's culture. So to do that, we're going to visualize our destination before we start. We really need to define the end state of where we want to go. Tidying is not our goal, but it is the tool to get us there. So we're going to establish a baseline and where we're going. We're going to put a plan in place just like you would if you were building out a new feature or starting a new app from scratch. And we'll task all this out and put it on our sprint or Kanban board. So as an example, let's say our destination is improved developer confidence when making changes and committing code. Our baseline is that we have no test coverage, no test suite at all, and no continuous integration. How are we going to get there? We're going to dedicate one person for an entire sprint, add a test framework to our code base. We're going to add one and only one passing test just to get this going. We're going to set test coverage thresholds up so that we fail the test suite when our coverage goes below that threshold. And then we're going to add a continuous integration hook to run the test suite on code push. We'll set expectations with our team. And again, we're going to task it out and put it on our Kanban or sprint board. Another example is our destination. We want to save time spent on minor nits and common bugs during code reviews. So our baseline today is that we have no code style guide defined or automated. We have no linters in use. We have comments in our code reviews are for formatting style and small or minor errors. And comments are more critical of the human than they are of the code. New devs get stuck on syntax and style, and they're also met with that same criticism. And more experienced devs get stuck debating that style. So how are we going to get there? We're going to, again, dedicate one person for an entire sprint. We'll use a standard style guide for our tech stack. We'll implement a linter on save of files. We'll implement a code formatter on save of files. So each of these will run whenever we save a file. And then we're going to run each of those one time on the entire code base. So we'll clean everything up in one fell swoop. Then we're going to set expectations with our team. And these expectations are, in this case, it's going to be that your IDE supports these automated linters and style guides. Or I'm sorry, automated linter and formatter. And then we're going to, again, we're going to task it out and put it on our Kanban or sprint board. So some other examples here, maybe you work on a legacy monolithic code base, and let's face it, most of us do. And we want to start extracting common functionality to APIs. So we might start by breaking the coupling and defining internal interfaces as a first step in our process. Maybe your team already has continuous integration to build and test the code base, but the next step will be continuous deployment to automate the process to a non-production environment. Maybe you have a test suite, but it only ever fails. It's running, but it's failing. And so you don't actually know if you broke anything. So at this point, that you might actually just get rid of that test suite if it's not useful to you, or it's so out of date that it's going to be more work to fix it than to just start from scratch. Or you might fix what's there. But again, in that case, you're still going to set expectations with your team that the test suite shouldn't be failing, and that if it is, you need to address it. So this is relevant for greenfield projects and for legacy code bases. The only difference is that when you're on a greenfield project, you get to define your vision at the start. You just can't lose sight of that vision along the way. And part of that is communicating up front to the rest of your teammates what your styles are, how code should be formatted, what your expectations are as far as testing and different processes within your team. So guideline 3 is that we need to discard what doesn't spark joy. We don't want to skip this step, because if we skip it, it just makes more work for you when we get to the actual tidying. Why tidy if we're just going to get rid of it? So we want to ask ourselves, does this spark the joy that I defined for myself and for my team? This dead code, does that spark joy, or does it just sit there rotting? Probably not. Probably just sits there and rots. You're never going to use it again. And if you do need it again, it's in version control, or at least it should be. But also, it's been sitting there, not used, and we'll have to retest it and maybe even make changes to it to make it work again. Since it hasn't been used, other parts of the system have changed, and they've probably changed the meaning of that dead code. So it's going to have to be looked at a lot closer than just uncommenting it or starting to use the code again directly. Dead features, if there is stuff that maybe one user is using or a very small number of users are using, it makes sense to weigh the costs of maintaining it versus the number of people using it and their happiness. If it is more costly for you to maintain it than it is for them to have it, it might make more sense to get rid of it. Also, maybe you have an unhelpful teammate on the team. Are they weighing you down, doing more harm than good, not working with the team, or siloing knowledge? They might not actually belong on the team. There could be a number of different things that are going on here. And if you're just an independent contributor on a team, you might feel like you can't do anything about this, but you can talk to your team lead, your management, or you can talk to this person and ask and see why this isn't working. And if you're a team lead, definitely don't take this seriously, because having a person like this on the team actually takes away from the rest of your team, their productivity and their developer happiness as well. And then what about those unmaintained tests? As I mentioned just a minute ago, if we have a test suite where we have some tests that are failing, or maybe the test suite doesn't run on any sort of a regular basis, are we ever going to fix those? And if not, let's just get rid of them. Maybe you have old tables or databases full of data that you don't need anymore. There's no code actually accessing it, and it just makes it confusing when someone has to dig into an issue. So let's get rid of it. Maybe you have a heavy process weighing your team down. If you do, I urge you to reevaluate it and to ditch it if you can. Guideline 4 is that we tidy by category, not by location. Marie Kondo talks about how we store the same type of item in more than one place in our house. If we tidy our bedroom first, then the kitchen, and then the mudroom, we are repeating our work and can't grasp the total number of shoes that we actually own because they are stored in all three places. We get locked into this cycle of just tidying and tidying and tidying when we're tidying by location. And the same goes for our code base. If we start with one module or functional area, and we implement code style guidelines and automated formatters in just that one module or functional area, how does that work when our actual feature work spans across multiple modules or multiple functional areas? What happens when a new developer joins the team and sees that one area has been cleaned up and one area is still messy? What approach do you think they're going to take? Do you think they'll be just as careful in as the old messy area? Probably not. They might just lose productivity trying to wade through it all too. And then we need to tidy in the right order. When we dive right into refactoring a big, hairy, complex, and hard to understand mess of a code base, it would probably be better to start with applying some better naming conventions across variables and functions. And before that big refactor, it would be good to have some tests in place so that we know we didn't break existing functionality. So let's look at the areas that we're going to tidy. After we've discarded, we're going to look at code formatting and style, common errors, testing, names and comments, refactoring, and then we're going to look beyond the code base. So for code formatting and style, we can use an automated code formatter to do this for us. So if you think about apostrophes, double quotes, single quotes, tabs versus spaces and how many, what we want our line length to be, and where our curly braces go, this is what an automated code formatter is going to handle for us. One example of this is Prettier. I've used this in JavaScript projects, but you can, it's supported for a variety of different languages like Ruby, CSS and Sass, JavaScript, TypeScript. And there are other tools like this out there too for other languages that might be better suited, but this is the one that I have the most experience with. And what this is going to do is it's going to eliminate nits in our code review comments, and it's going to help newcomers. It stops the team debates about whose style opinions are better. And we can do this by picking one style up front and sticking to it. This particular tool has, it has its default style format that it uses, and there are a few customizations that you can do as well. And then again, I mentioned like tidying in the right order, and by doing this first, code formatting and style, we're starting at square one. We're going to start with consistently formatted files, and it's going to help us be able to read the code better. If you can't run this on every file all at one time, you can do it on a file by file basis. I definitely recommend trying to do it on everything all at once. So you're starting from scratch or starting from a clean slate on the entire code base as far as format. But if you can't, you can do it on a file by file basis. On one team, we did this on a file by file basis where anytime you went in to touch that file and make a change to that file, you would have to reformat it and do any sort of cleanup, potentially even adding unit tests to it. So there's one question in Slack about whether this should be a team job instead of one person. Yes, this should be the team job. Ongoing, it should be a team job. So we need to be setting, like I said before, we're going to be setting expectations on what type of code formatting and style should be used on the team, and the team has to adhere to that. And if there is a reason why we're going to deviate from that, or we want to change a standard, then it is a decision that we make as a team. What I'm talking about here, though, is at least immediately right here is by doing an initial pass at all of the files. So if you have a legacy code base and a lot of files have different code formatting and style, you can take these tools and apply them to every file and commit that so everyone is working from the same state. And from that point forward, you have those expectations in place that your team is going to format and follow these new styles. Okay, so the next one is we're going to address common errors. We can use a linter like ESLint to find common programming mistakes like deprecated APIs, unused variables or functions, undefined variable assignments, and security vulnerabilities. These static analysis tools, both the code formatters and style formatters and these linters, we can use these to prioritize our plan or to keep our code tidy going forward. They can be integrated directly into our IDE or our editor. So on file save, it automatically runs the formatter and the linter. It can be integrated into build tools or the command line, and also into Git pre-commit hooks. Some other examples here would be Dependabot, which helps address security vulnerabilities of out-of-date dependencies right in GitHub. And then npm audit, which looks at your package JSON file and tells you or fixes out-of-date dependencies for you. Testing is another area that we need to tidy. And having a well-maintained passing test suite allows us to confidently change our code. So we need to introduce a test suite. Maybe it's just one test because we're starting with a big hairy mess of code and we don't even have a test suite set up yet. That's okay. We also want to introduce the concept of test coverage and establish a threshold. One note about this test coverage and threshold is that 100% test coverage is not necessarily a good thing. Often that's a smell that you are testing too much. So take into consideration what your team needs, what your product needs, how frequently certain areas are changing, and set your test thresholds or coverage thresholds accordingly. We're also going to set tests to run on save. So we can use a test suite that supports watching for files that have changed, and then it reruns affected tests. So if I change one file and there are 4 tests that happen to cover that file, we can get feedback immediately from automatically running those tests. And then we want to keep our tests clean. Our clean tests are communicating the intent of our code, and they communicate our requirements. If they're not readable, it makes it more difficult to confidently change our code. And one thing to note about these tests, if they're in place and they're passing, those are the requirements of your code. it might be that that wasn't the original intent, but that is the current intent of your code. This is especially important when you're working in a legacy system where users are relying on that current functionality. So those tests are saying this is what it currently does. It might be that wasn't the original intent, but that is what we need to maintain right now. And we'll get into that a little bit more in the refactoring section. So both names and comments are going to communicate to your reader. Again, just like tests communicate the intent, names and comments do the same. We use naming conventions that are used by our stakeholders and customers so that we match it with the business domain. Not only will it make it easier on our conversations with them, but it will also make it easier for developers to read and understand the code and what it's doing if we're all talking the same language. If our code has a different naming convention than our database, and both of those have a different naming convention than what our customer uses, it makes it really hard for that conversation to happen and for people to understand what's going on. So we can change variable names, function names, parameter names, class names, file names. This is how we communicate to the reader what's happening. So here's a very trivial example. Who knows what this copy function is actually doing or what those arguments represent? We can, however, rename those arguments to source and destination to communicate what they represent. Just be aware that in some cases, while this can be a low-risk change, renaming things, for instance, with typed languages, it's a little bit lower risk, but in other cases, you'll need to be more careful and rely on tests and not the compiler. Comments should also describe why you're doing something, not what your code is doing. If your comment is describing the what, you can likely change the variables or the function names to communicate that. In this example, this conditional has a comment indicating what this logic is actually doing and what it means. But we can actually rewrite this to be more communicative. If we push that logic into its own function and use a descriptive name for it, we're able to communicate what is happening and what it actually means. And then there's refactoring. If you're new to this term, refactoring is a series of small structural modifications supported by tests to make the code easier to change. At one of my jobs a long time ago, I worked on a massive and highly coupled code base that had very little test coverage. It was one that basically represented our team structure, not actual functional areas of our business. We had a huge and team-wide effort to fix a lot of this, decoupling the various parts from one another in an effort to break off into services. To do that, we ended up having to spend a lot of time learning how to do it. We practiced, we read about the process of refactoring, and we did this using what is known as the Michael Feathers book. The actual title of the book is Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And there's a number of different books out there that talk about refactoring, but this one, I highly recommend it if you're working in a legacy code system. Codebase, it has a lot of techniques and tricks to being able to break apart your dependencies and get areas under test in a way where you're lowering risk as you refactor. So the algorithm he defines for refactoring legacy code is this. And I'm going to leave the majority of this to his book because it's an entire book. It could be an entire workshop. But it goes like this. First, we have to identify change points. We figure out where we need to make our changes. Sometimes that's actually really hard. And so in his book, he talks about dealing with that, techniques to figure out where you make your changes. Second, we want to find test points. And this can be difficult in legacy code because we have, often it's very highly coupled and not in the right way. But there are techniques to determine where to write tests for a particular change. Third, we want to break those dependencies. Dependencies are an obvious obstacle to testing, and this book shares techniques on how to do just that. Fourth, we're going to write tests. We finally get to write the tests, and they're going to be a little bit different than what we'd write for a new code. It might not be, it's going to be a little bit different. Our goal here, it's not necessarily to find bugs, but to get tests in place to be confident in making changes. So I mentioned earlier that with a legacy code system, if we have passing tests, that's communicating how it's currently working. It's communicating the current intent. It might not be the original requirements, but that is what is currently what users are actually relying on. And so in these tests that we're writing during our refactoring, again, it's not to find bugs against our original requirements. It's to preserve behavior, and we do this using characterization tests, and that's what this is doing, is writing a test for us to understand what's happening so that we don't break it when we make our changes. And then step 5, is there someone that could mute their, not sure why it's not muted, but anyways, okay. So in step 5, we're making our changes in refactoring. Finally, we're at the point where we can refactor and add new features to our legacy code using test-driven development. So that's the algorithm. Like I said, this book it's a popular one. It's, I think, like 16 or 17 years old. I can't remember what language the examples are in. It might be Java or C++. I can't remember. But even if that's not what you're working in today, even if you're working in JavaScript or TypeScript or some other language, these examples are going to be very relevant to the examples and techniques are going to be very relevant to being able to refactor your code base. So then we need to look beyond the code base, and these are not in any order. I think there are probably different pieces here within each of these that should be addressed. Obviously, security is extremely important. So we might want to look at doing some audits. There are plenty of security checklists out there. There's a good OWASP one on their website for kind of top 10 things to address for a web project. For user experience and design, those disciplines also use style guides and patterns to not only make what you're doing, make the experience and the look and feel and the emotion of what your application or your system consistent, but it also helps other developers. So as an example, I've had style guides for on teams where there have been back-end developers who just happen to need to do front-end code changes. With those style guides, it makes it a little bit easier to know, like, the button should look like this, headings look like this. Having those communicated and available for people to reference is going to be important in having that consistency. And then last, monitoring and observability. Remember back when I was defining what joy looked like to me, I mentioned being able to respond to customer issues and knowing before they do when something is wrong. If you don't have any sort of client-side error logging traces or easily searchable server logs available right now in your production environment, and that is something that's holding you up from investigating issues with your customers, I might actually prioritize this higher than reformatting files in your code base. So again, there's different areas that can be cleaned. These are just some extra ones that go beyond the actual code itself. So back to our guidelines, we want to tidy a little every day. We first have to change our way of thinking, and then we can keep it tidy ongoing because we've established it as a habit. And to make this a habit, we need to train people, set expectations, have a plan, and reserve time for tidying. Now, this should be a common theme. I've mentioned these throughout this talk multiple times, but let's dig into them a little bit more. So again, we need to train people. People need to learn the tools. They need to know what's in their toolbox and how to use it. They need to learn about software design principles and clean code. Learn the refactoring techniques. Read the Michael Feathers book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. And there's a technique in that book that can be pretty useful, both in learning more about your code and how to actually do refactoring. And that's called scratch refactoring. It's a way of practicing in your code base on your own, and then you throw it away. And there are other ways of practicing as well. There are some online code katas that I found that are designed just for learning how to refactor. And then another one that I recommend is starting a book club at work or in your non-work tech Slack. That job that I mentioned from a while ago, where we were using the techniques in this book to pull apart our code base and refactor it and get it under test and pull off different services. We actually started by having a book club, and our management team was, they were kind enough to purchase the books for us. We met weekly. We started incorporating some of those techniques into our code base as we were learning how to do stuff. We were given the freedom to actually try stuff out and to learn about refactoring as we needed to be doing it. So if you can do that, I highly recommend being able to start that way with a book club, or at the very least looking into this. And then second, we want to set expectations. Again, I've mentioned this multiple times, but if we define our style guide, we've settled on what we want our files to look like, the style and format, but we don't document it or communicate it to our team, then people aren't going to actually do it. So we want to define it, document, and communicate it. We're going to set test coverage expectations. If code coverage goes below X%, there's a build failure and you have to bump it up. Again, we don't want any broken builds. We want to address these earlier. And then last, we want to leave the code base better than we found it. If everyone is doing this every day, the health of our code base is going to improve. Third, we want to have a plan. Again, I've mentioned this before. We're going to plan it out like we would a new feature or a project. We're going to task it out. We'll put it in the Kanban or sprint board. We're going to set goals and track to them. And then we want to make progress visible. And this, I realize this is a little bit difficult since we're all mostly at home, not co-located in offices right now. But when we go back to doing that, or if you do, one way to do this is by putting your goal, your baseline and your goals on a whiteboard and then tracking progress. So you can do that with a good way of doing that is with test coverage. That can also be shown in some test suites as well. And then fourth, we're going to reserve time for tidying. If we build this into our sprints, whether it's 25% of one person or 100% of the entire team, and do this every sprint, we're actually going to be able to make some progress here. If you want to call it a tidy task, go for it. Tidy tax, go for it. It's similar to allocating time for testing or for addressing technical debt, but it's time that you need to spend on maintaining your code base. So Marie Kondo also proposes that you tidy your house all at once, so you're starting fresh and put good habits in place. I think this can work for some of us in some cases, but maybe not all of them. Taking 3 months to tidy our code base and not deliver any new features probably isn't going to go over very well with our stakeholders. So that approach can work a little bit better on smaller code bases or smaller teams, or maybe lower something that is an application or system that is not as high priority as something else. It also probably makes sense to do this in the off season, at least the initial pass at tidying, just in case something does go wrong. You're not dealing with high priority issues in addition to a breaking change from either a refactoring or one of your linters going awry. But again, if you can't reserve 3 months of your entire team to do this, don't let it stop you. You don't have to drop everything for a dedicated effort. The process above is still going to work. You just have to reserve time for tidying every day. So again, you're going to visualize the destination, make a plan for how and when you'll make these changes over time. You'll set expectations for tidying every day. Again, you're going to always leave it better than when you arrived. And then you're going to set expectations that all new code, tools, and processes will adhere to the new destination. So you've visualized what you want. Now you need to set expectations that new code, tools, and processes are going to adhere to it. And if they can't, then it deserves a conversation and an explicit exception with a plan for the future. So if there's an area of the code base that you can't write tests against right now, maybe it's maybe you have a tight timeline and it just doesn't make sense at the moment. You can, I'm not going to say you should not write tests, but if that is the case and that's the decision that's been made, still make a plan for when you're going to come back and address those tests. So I'll leave you with a few parting words. Clearing the digital clutter will help you clear the mental clutter. So thank you all for coming today. There's a few minutes left for any questions if anyone has anything. I will share these slides and some additional resources, including links to the books I've referenced here in Slack right after this. So feel free to ask questions in Slack, and I can answer questions after in Slack as well. So multiple people are typing. Okay, so one question is, what do I prefer, test coverage level measured on the repository level or the file level? Again, I think it probably depends on your code base and where the more riskier areas or the more brittle areas of your code are, or what changes frequently. I've done it both ways. As far as measuring, I think generally we've measured at either the repository level or at kind of high level module levels. So module or folder levels, it kind of just depends on terminology, but I've definitely seen it done both ways. Again, in my mind, it depends on how frequently that code changes, what you're testing. If you have a module that is very critical to your application, it might make more sense to have more, it probably makes more sense to have better code coverage there. But if you have something that changes very infrequently, but it's also critical, it might make sense to have more code coverage there as well. Any tips to influence management that time should be allocated to this? Yeah, I mean, that is, I was thinking about that a lot during while writing this talk, and I think the one slide on cost savings is important, and that really speaks to what they're looking for. Obviously, they want their customers to be happy, and they want high quality, and they want their developers to be happy, but it really all comes down to how much money that's costing. So if your code is not high quality and it's costing more money to fix bugs and it's costing more money to debug or even to write new features, there's as time goes on, the cost that it takes for a team to actually implement new time that it takes for a team to implement new features actually goes up, and it becomes more difficult. And when time goes up, it becomes more costly. I don't have specific numbers related to this, so that's maybe feedback for the next time I give this talk, but definitely like address the cost piece of it. It takes time. Your developers are going to be more productive. They'll be more happy. So yeah. What else do we have? Yeah. Okay. So the next question is, having large teams could lead to a range of differing opinions. Any tips on finding a common ground without making it feel imposed? That is a good question. The way I've done this in the past has really been, there are like, it's good to have everybody's input, but for a large team, it probably makes sense to have maybe a committee of people that make those decisions and communicate them. For smaller teams, maybe a team of 5 or 10 people, it might make more sense to do it collaboratively and actually make the decisions individually. Another thing that I think you can do to kind of alleviate some of that is choose a style guide or formatting guide that is standard for your tech stack. This is one of the links that I'll share. There's a number of different style guides out there for different languages and tech stacks and frameworks, and it is more useful to use one of those so that if someone comes or goes from your team, they have common expectations across maybe different jobs or teams on how something should be formatted or styled or addressed. Yeah, Arun just made a comment, and I will read this out. I've tended to just go and refactor in a separate branch and then show it to others to see if they liked it. And it's worked a few times. I definitely encouraged that. whether it is in the style of Michael Feathers' scratch refactoring or it's just trying something out. You have branches are free. You can create a branch, you can try it, you can delete it, you can show it off, or you can just use it and ask for instead of asking for permission, ask for forgiveness after you've merged it in, or have the team review it, however, whatever your process is. But definitely, I definitely encourage trying stuff out before you, especially if this is a new process for you, the refactoring process. It's very easy to get started and to try something. The actual act of refactoring and getting an enter test is a different story, obviously. Okay, are there any other questions? I don't see any here, so I don't want to keep people. If not, I'm I will be in and out of Slack the rest of the afternoon and tomorrow as well. If you have any questions, feel free to bug me there. Thank you.